He did not walk into music the way most legends do. He did not dream of stages. He did not chase spotlights. He did not imagine crowds calling his name. He began in a quiet house in Akron, Ohio, where faith set the rhythm of the day and discipline shaped every hour. A house where silence was not emptiness, but order. Where voices were raised for prayer, not for attention. And yet, somewhere inside that stillness, a voice was waiting. The strange thing is this: he didn't believe in it. Not really. He thought his voice was too rough, too plain, too ordinary to matter in a world that celebrated shine and spectacle. He believed music lived in his hands, not his throat, in piano keys, in chords carefully learned and repeated. He was comfortable there behind the sound, not inside it. That belief followed him for years, even as gospel filled the air around him, even as choirs rose and fell each Sunday, even as people noticed something warm and steady when he sang along quietly, never stepping forward. This is where his story begins, not with confidence, but with doubt. Because sometimes the voices that change the world are born in people who never expected to be heard. James Ingram grew up in a home built on faith and restraint. His father was a deacon and a Sunday school teacher, a man who believed discipline was a form of devotion. His mother carried the same steadiness. Church was not an option, it was a constant. 3 times a week. No movies. No distractions. No noise that didn't serve a purpose. Music existed there, but not as ambition. It was worship. It was structure. It was something you respected, not something you chased. Gospel poured from radios and rehearsals, and James listened closely, not because he saw a future in it, but because sound felt like a language he understood instinctively. Before he ever trusted his own voice, he trusted harmony, timing, the way emotion could be carried without being forced. His hero wasn't a singer. It was Jimmy Smith, the jazz organist, whose fingers moved like prayer. When James sat at a piano around the age of 12, he wasn't trying to become a star. He was trying to feel something. He taught himself Stevie Wonder's My Cherie Amour, chord by chord, until the instrument felt like another voice living inside him. Music ran in the family. His older brother Henry carried a kind of raw, undeniable ability, the kind that filled rooms without asking permission. He rose quickly, becoming minister of music for the entire state of Ohio. Congregations stood when he sang. James watched him carefully. He admired him. He learned from him. And quietly, he stepped aside. Because standing next to that kind of talent didn't inspire competition. It inspired caution. James chose the background, the keyboard, the place where music could exist without scrutiny. By the time he reached high school, he joined a local group called Sharpie and the G Clefs, a band of older musicians who sharpened his instincts and pushed him further than he expected to go. They taught him timing, discipline, the unspoken rule that music rewards those who keep showing up, even when no one is watching. Still, he did not call himself a singer. After graduation, he earned a track scholarship to the University of Akron. Running paid the bills. Music fed something quieter, something harder to explain. He joined a band called Revelation Funk, played keys, sang background, and stayed comfortably just outside the center of attention. Even when the band dreamed bigger packing up and heading to Los Angeles, James did not imagine fame waiting on the other side. He imagined possibility, nothing more. When the band dissolved after a single soundtrack song, most of the members went home. James stayed. That choice was not dramatic. It wasn't brave. It was patient. He shared a small apartment. His girlfriend Deborah moved across the country to support him, bringing recording equipment so he could keep writing, keep practicing, keep listening to a voice he still didn't trust. He crossed paths with legends Marvin Gaye, musicians from Ray Charles' circle, but always on the edges. Small moments, passing sparks, hints of a world that might open one day. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the very thing he doubted would become his signature. That the roughness he tried to soften was the warmth people would hold on to. That the voice he kept in the background was already powerful enough to stop the world once the right ears heard it. And when that moment came, it would not arrive with noise. It would arrive quietly, through a single song, a single listener, and a truth he had never allowed himself to believe, that his voice, exactly as it was enough. Before music became a career, it was a rule. In the house where James Ingram grew up, sound was never casual. Faith set the tempo. Discipline decided when things began and when they ended. Church was not an event, it was a rhythm. 3 times a week, without exception. No movies. No wandering distractions. Life moved inside clearly drawn lines. Music lived there, but it lived under purpose. Gospel wasn't entertainment, it was instruction. Choirs rehearsed the same way sermons were delivered, precise, intentional, grounded. You didn't sing to impress. You sang to serve. That distinction mattered. It shaped how James listened, how he played, and how he understood sound long before he understood himself. He learned early that music could hold people steady, not excite them, not provoke them, steady them. That lesson stayed. When he wasn't at church, he was listening quietly. Radios humming in the background, rehearsals bleeding into the house. He absorbed structure before he absorbed style, timing before ego. He paid attention to how voices blended, how restraint created space, how emotion traveled without being announced. At 12, the piano became his refuge, not a stage, a shelter. He wasn't chasing applause when he sat down at the keys. He was chasing feeling, the kind that settles instead of explodes. He taught himself songs the long way, 1 chord at a time. Stevie Wonder's My Cherie Amour became a private lesson in patience, in how warmth could be carried without force. The piano didn't judge him. It didn't ask him to be confident. It didn't ask him to be bold. It let him exist behind the sound. That suited him. Music, in his family, was not hypothetical. It was embodied. His older brother Henry possessed a gift that filled rooms without effort. Congregations stood when Henry sang. His rise was fast, undeniable. Soon he became minister of music for the entire state of Ohio. James watched from the side. He didn't resent it. He didn't compete with it. He learned from it. He learned that talent could be powerful and heavy. That standing in front carried expectations you didn't get to negotiate. He chose the background not because he lacked ability, but because he valued stability. The keyboard felt honest, supportive, necessary, without being exposed. In that choice, something important formed. Humility, not as insecurity, but as orientation. By 9th grade, he joined a local group, Sharpie and the G Clefs. The band was older, more experienced, less forgiving. They didn't coddle. They demanded punctuality, precision, endurance. They taught him what rehearsal really meant, showing up tired, playing clean anyway, respecting the work. Music, again, revealed itself as labor. After high school, he earned a track scholarship to the University of Akron. Running paid the bills. Music kept him balanced. The discipline of training matched what he already knew: breath control, repetition, endurance. He joined Revelation Funk, played keyboards, sang a little in the background, and continued doing what felt natural. He still did not call himself a singer, even as people noticed the warmth in his voice. Even as moments arrived where he could have stepped forward. He stayed where he believed he belonged, behind the sound. When Revelation Funk decided to head to Los Angeles, the move wasn't framed as destiny. It was framed as curiosity. A question, not a declaration. What happens if we try? They tried. The city didn't reward them quickly. 1 soundtrack placement. Then, silence. Momentum faded. 1 by 1, band members returned home, practical and disappointed. James stayed. Not out of stubbornness, out of quiet resolve. He shared small spaces, worked where he could. His girlfriend Deborah moved across the country to support him, carrying recording equipment so he could keep writing, keep practicing, keep listening. Her presence wasn't dramatic. It was steady, another form of discipline. He crossed paths with greatness in fragments. Marvin Gaye, musicians in Ray Charles' orbit. Nothing concrete, nothing promised. Just proximity enough to suggest that possibility existed. Still, James did not rush forward, because ambition had never been his engine. Music, for him, was never about arrival. It was about alignment. And alignment takes time. What he didn't realize yet was that all this restraint, all this discipline, humility, and patience was not keeping him from the center. It was preparing him for it. Because when the world finally heard his voice, it would not hear polish or bravado. It would hear something rarer, a man who sang the way he lived, carefully, honestly, and without ever needing to raise his voice to be felt. Los Angeles did not greet him with certainty. It greeted him with space. Wide streets, long drives, rooms filled with people chasing something louder than themselves. For many artists, the city demands urgency. Prove it now. Be visible. Take the spotlight before someone else does. James Ingram moved differently. He arrived without a plan to be seen. He wasn't chasing discovery. He was testing endurance. He wanted to know if the discipline he carried from Akron could survive a place that rewarded impatience. The band had come with hope. The band left with realism. After a single soundtrack placement, one brief moment of momentum, the dream dissolved. Bills didn't wait. Opportunity didn't linger. One by one, the members returned home, choosing certainty over struggle. James stayed. Not because he believed success was close, but because leaving felt unfinished. He shared a small apartment, the kind of place where silence stretches and doubt has room to speak. His girlfriend Deborah followed him west, not with promises, but with equipment. Recording gear, tools. The quiet message that said, "Keep going, even if no one is watching." That mattered more than applause ever could. He worked where he could, played keys, helped shape songs that would never carry his name. He said yes to background roles without bitterness. In rooms where ambition filled the air, he remained grounded, almost invisible. But invisible doesn't mean absent. He listened. He learned how studios worked, how songs were constructed from fragments, how emotion could be refined without being drained. He watched singers who pushed too hard and burned out quickly. Watched others compromise themselves for proximity to power. James took notes internally. This was not a man racing toward the front of the line. This was a man studying the architecture of the building. He crossed paths with legends not as turning points, but as reminders. Marvin Gaye in passing. Musicians tied to Ray Charles' circle. Brief conversations. Fleeting proximity. Enough to understand how fragile greatness could be when unsupported by grounding. Still, he didn't step forward, even as people noticed his voice. Even as collaborators suggested he sing leads. He hesitated. Not from fear, but from disbelief. He had spent his life understanding music as service, not declaration. Singing, to him, still felt exposed. Too personal. Too revealing. The piano offered distance. The keyboard allowed him to shape emotion without becoming its center. And yet, something was shifting. Slowly, almost against his will, his voice began entering rooms before he did. A background harmony would linger longer than expected. A demo vocal would stop conversations. People would ask who sang that line, not knowing it came from the quiet man behind the keys. James noticed, but he didn't rush to claim it. Instead, he signed a modest publishing deal. The kind of arrangement that pays quietly and teaches patience. $50 per demo. No glory. No guarantees. Just repetition. And repetition taught him something important. Writing sharpened him. It taught him how to shape emotion deliberately. How to land tenderness without collapsing into sentimentality. How to trust the grain of his voice, even when he still believed it wasn't special enough to stand alone. He played keyboards for others. Helped create bass synth patterns that would later become iconic. Contributed ideas that elevated records without attaching his name to them. He was building credibility without visibility. That, too, was discipline. Los Angeles has a way of revealing people to themselves. It magnifies intention. It exposes impatience. It rewards those who can sit inside uncertainty without flinching. James did that. Day after day. Session after session. Without spectacle. He did not reinvent himself. He did not harden. He stayed exactly who he was. Which is why, when the moment finally arrived, when a single song would travel from one desk to another and land in the hands of someone who truly listened, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like timing. All the restraint, all the doubt, All the years spent behind the sound, they had not delayed his arrival. They had prepared him for it. And the voice he still questioned, the one he kept offering quietly, without confidence, was about to be heard by ears that recognized its truth immediately. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. And honesty, when it finally meets the right listener, does not need to explain itself. Success did not arrive with a spotlight. It arrived as a phone call. By the time James Ingram wrote Just Once, he had learned how to disappear into the work. He was a songwriter on assignment, a keyboard player in other people's sessions, a voice used to fill space rather than claim it. The publishing deal paid modestly $50 per demo, but the real compensation was repetition, draft after draft, feeling after feeling shaped into melody. Just Once wasn't written to change his life. It was written to be useful. A clean structure, honest emotion, a vocal laid down without protection or polish. James didn't dress the song up because he didn't know how to. He sang the way he always had, carefully, earnestly, slightly apologetic, as if the voice itself needed permission to exist. That demo traveled quietly, from one desk to another, from one set of ears to the next, until it reached someone who listened differently. In the studio, when James finally stood in front of the microphone, doubt returned immediately. He cleared his throat, apologized for the roughness he heard in himself, tried to soften edges he believed were flaws. The producer stopped him. Not gently, not dramatically, just firmly. Stop clearing your throat. That's your sound. It was the first time anyone had said it that way. Not, you can sing. Not, this will work. But this is who you are. Just Once in 100 Ways became the emotional center of the album they were placed on. When the record was released in 1981, the response was immediate. The songs didn't shout their way up the charts. They settled there steady, undeniable. Listeners heard something familiar and new at the same time. A voice that didn't perform vulnerability. It inhabited it. Before James ever released an album of his own, he won a Grammy. It was rare. It was historic. And it was disorienting, because success had arrived before self-belief. There was no moment of preparation, no gradual adjustment. One day he was a background presence. The next, his voice was everywhere: radios, living rooms, wedding aisles, late-night drives where people needed something gentle enough to hold them together. The industry took notice quickly. Then came another call. This time, the scale was different. He was asked to contribute lyrics to a project that would soon outgrow its own boundaries. One song, one assignment. No spotlight attached to his name. Just work. He wrote the words to P. Id. Dote. Pretty Young Thing. When the album was released, it didn't just succeed. It reshaped the landscape. Millions upon millions of copies moved across the world. The record became a cultural event, then a benchmark, then a memory people would return to for decades. James' pen was part of it, quietly, precisely, without spectacle. In 1983, he finally released his debut album, It's Your Night. The duet, Ya Mo Be, there soared across radio, pairing his warmth with Michael McDonald's familiar grit. The song crossed genres effortlessly, earning another Grammy and confirming what listeners already felt, that James Ingram belonged everywhere without forcing himself into any single lane. Soon after, Baby Come to Me found a second life through television, climbing charts years after its release and becoming a #1 hit almost by accident. That pattern would repeat. James didn't chase moments. Moments found him. Throughout the mid-'80s, his voice appeared in places that mattered. Film soundtracks, benefit projects, duets that felt less like performances and more like conversations. We Are the World. The Color Purple. Collaborations that asked for sincerity, not ego. His voice adapted without losing itself. Soft when needed. Strong when required. Always human. What made his rise unusual wasn't just the speed, it was the absence of hunger behind it. He never sounded like someone reaching upward. He sounded like someone holding something steady while the world leaned in. By the late 80s, James Ingram had become more than a successful singer. He was a craftsman, a bridge between gospel devotion, R&B soul, and pop elegance. a presence that reassured listeners without demanding their attention. His songs didn't interrupt lives, they accompanied them. This was the height. The moment when the world lifted him higher than he ever imagined a quiet boy from Akron could stand. And still, inside him, the doubt never fully left. Because being chosen by the world is not the same as choosing yourself. And that unresolved tension between the voice people heard and the man who still questioned it would quietly shape everything that followed. Fame has a way of arriving with instructions. Not written ones, unspoken ones. Once the world recognizes a voice, it begins to imagine what that voice should become, how it should look, where it should live, who it should be compared to. Success, especially the kind James Ingram found, rarely comes alone. It brings expectations that feel reasonable at first and then slowly become heavy. By the mid-1980s, the industry knew exactly where it wanted to place him. A crossover star, a successor, a familiar path already proven to work. They saw a man who could move easily between R&B and pop, who could sit beside soft rock and adult contemporary without resistance. They wanted him shaped into something clean and predictable, a voice that could be packaged, scheduled, and repeated. On paper, it made sense. In his chest, it didn't. James had never sung to dominate space. He didn't project confidence the way pop stardom demanded. His strength lived in restraint, in warmth, not shine. He came from gospel, where sincerity mattered more than image, where voices existed to support rather than compete. And yet, albums kept coming. Never felt so good. It's real. Always you. Each carried moments of beauty. Each reminded listeners of his gift. But behind the scenes, something subtle was happening. The distance between who he was and who he was expected to be grew wider with every release. He didn't rebel. He didn't complain. He adapted. But adaptation has a cost. The pressure wasn't dramatic. There were no public breakdowns or headlines. It showed up as fatigue, as a quiet sense of displacement, as the feeling of standing in rooms designed for someone else's personality. James had never chased being the star. He had chased alignment. And now, alignment felt harder to find. Gradually, his presence shifted. He became a voice called upon for specific moments rather than an artist pushed relentlessly forward. Film soundtracks welcomed him. Special projects sought him out. His music appeared in stories that needed emotional weight without distraction. It wasn't failure. It was transition. The spotlight softened, but the work continued. James leaned into family life. Fatherhood grounded him. He found comfort in routines that fame often disrupts: home, consistency, being present in ways the industry rarely values. Years passed. 15 of them. No new studio album arrived, but his voice never disappeared. He toured lightly, performed on cruise stages, reconnected with old collaborators. Royalty checks arrived from work done decades earlier, reminders that impact doesn't vanish just because momentum slows. On stage, the warmth remained. Audiences still stood, still listened, still felt held. But offstage, something else was quietly shifting. Around the middle of the next decade, those closest to him noticed small changes. Stories repeated. Names slipped away mid-sentence. Conversations paused where they once flowed effortlessly. At first, it felt like age, like distraction, like nothing worth naming. Then, the forgetting grew heavier. By 2017, the truth could no longer be softened. Conversations became difficult to finish. Memories drifted in and out. The diagnoses followed: early Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, the same conditions that had touched his mother years earlier. A cruel inheritance. Music became harder. Performing became impossible. The voice that had once carried others through heartbreak and healing was now wrestling with a mind slowly stepping away from the world it once illuminated. There were no announcements, no farewell tour, no closing statements. James stepped back the same way he had lived much of his life, quietly. He returned to stillness. And in that stillness, something profound revealed itself. Even as his memory faded, his presence did not. Songs continued to play in places he could no longer visit. Weddings, radio blocks, late-night drives, moments when people needed something gentle enough not to break them. The industry moved on, as it always does. But listeners didn't. Because James Ingram had never belonged to a moment. He belonged to feeling. And feeling doesn't age the way charts do. As his world narrowed, the one he had built through music remained wide open, carrying warmth, sincerity, and the quiet truth he had always lived by. That you don't need to be loud to be lasting. That you don't need to belong to the center to matter. And that some voices are most powerful not when they chase the spotlight, but when they leave room for others to breathe. There is a particular cruelty when a life built on remembrance begins to forget itself. For James Ingram, the change did not arrive as a collapse. It arrived as a drift, slow, almost polite, easy to explain away at first. A repeated story. A missing name. A pause where certainty used to live. Those closest to him noticed before anyone else. Not because they were looking for signs, but because they knew his rhythms. James had always been deliberate with words, thoughtful, present. When sentences began to trail off, when memories took longer to return, it felt unfamiliar in a way that couldn't be ignored. At first, it was subtle enough to dismiss. Everyone forgets things. Everyone slows down. But this was different. Conversations became harder to complete. Details slipped through cracks that hadn't existed before. Moments that once carried emotional weight now floated past without anchors. The warmth remained, but the map that guided it was beginning to fade. The diagnoses came quietly. Early Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, the same conditions that had once touched his mother, now returning through blood and time. There was no drama in the way it was revealed. No public statements. No interviews. Just a family absorbing the truth in private, learning how to name something that could not be argued with. Music changed immediately, not in quality but in accessibility. Performing required memory, coordination, precision. Things James had relied on without thinking now demanded effort. The stage, once a place of gentle connection, became unpredictable. Lyrics that lived in muscle memory began slipping away. Timing faltered. Confidence thinned. Eventually, performing became impossible. And so he stepped back. No farewell tour. No final album announcement. No attempt to frame the moment. He simply returned to stillness. The same stillness where his story had begun. As his world narrowed, something unexpected happened. His music kept moving. While memory loosened its grip, songs continued their quiet work, traveling through radios, ceremonies, and moments where people needed softness more than spectacle. Weddings still chose Baby Come to Me. Late-night drives still leaned on Just Once. Duets still felt like conversations, not performances. The contrast was painful. A man whose voice had held so many memories was now losing his own. Yet those who spent time with him in those years speak of gentleness, not disappearance. He was still present emotionally, even when details escaped him. Still kind, still warm, still capable of listening, even when speaking became harder. The industry, predictably, moved on. Trends shifted. New voices filled the air. Time did what time always does. But listeners didn't forget. Because James Ingram had never been a momentary voice. He had been a companion, a constant. Someone people associated with tenderness rather than triumph. His songs weren't tied to youth or fashion. They were tied to feeling, and feeling ages differently. As his health declined, tributes began surfacing quietly. Not grand retrospectives, just acknowledgments. Artists speaking about what it meant to sing beside him. Producers remembering how little he needed to take over a room. Friends describing a man who never confused talent with entitlement. When he passed, the reaction felt less like shock and more like collective recognition. A warmth had left the room. Radio stations didn't rush announcements. They played blocks of his music uninterrupted. Callers didn't ask for hits. They shared memories. A wedding. A breakup. A night drive when his voice felt like the only thing steady enough to lean on. Outside the United States, the response carried the same tone. Japan revisited his catalog with reverence. European audiences remembered him as a singer who made vulnerability sound dignified. Critics wrote about his phrasing the way one might write about touch gentle, intentional, honest. What people mourned wasn't just the man. It was the reassurance he represented. James Ingram had never sung to impress. He sang to comfort. To remind listeners that love didn't need volume to be real. That strength could exist without force. In the end, his memory faded before his music did. But perhaps that is not tragedy. Perhaps it is proof of what he built. Because some voices are not meant to dominate history. They are meant to stay with us quietly, long after the details blur, long after the names soften, still doing the work they were always meant to do, holding people steady, even when the singer himself no longer could. When the music world speaks about legacy, it often reaches for numbers. Awards won, records sold, moments that made history loud enough to be measured. But James Ingram did not leave behind a legacy that asks to be counted. He left one that asks to be felt. After his passing, there was no scramble to rewrite his importance. No sudden realization that came too late. His place had already been decided quietly, over decades, in living rooms and cars and moments where people needed something gentle enough to trust. Radio stations didn't frame his songs as nostalgia. They let them play without interruption. DJs didn't rush to explain why he mattered. They didn't need to. The listeners already knew. Calls came in not to request tracks, but to remember. A wedding where Baby Come to Me felt like a promise spoken out loud. A breakup where just once said what couldn't be said any other way. A late-night drive where his voice made the road feel less lonely. These weren't fans talking about a star. They were people talking about a companion. Across the world, the response carried the same tone. In Japan, where his ballads had lived on long after American radio shifted elsewhere, listeners spoke of him with reverence. In Europe, critics revisited his work not as pop history, but as emotional craftsmanship. In France, they called his singing vulnerable without being fragile. In Canada, adult contemporary stations treated his catalog like a safe place, something you return to when noise becomes too much. What united these places wasn't genre, it was trust. James Ingram had earned it without ever demanding it. Artists who worked beside him spoke with unusual softness. Quincy Jones called him a gift, not a weapon, not a phenomenon, but a gift. Michael McDonald remembered how their voices blended without effort, as if they had grown up in the same choir. Patty Austin described their duets as conversations rather than performances. No one spoke about ego. No one spoke about rivalry. They spoke about ease, about generosity, about a man who never tried to be larger than the song, and that may be the quiet miracle of his career. He existed in an industry built on volume, yet chose restraint. In a culture that rewards ambition, he chose sincerity. In a world obsessed with reinvention, he stayed recognizably himself. Even his departure reflected that truth. There was no farewell spectacle. No final campaign, no attempt to frame the ending. He simply stepped back, returning to the stillness where he had begun. And somehow, that made the music louder. Because when the voice was no longer present, people realized how often it had been there for them. How frequently it had softened moments without announcing itself. How deeply it had woven itself into the fabric of ordinary life. That is not a small legacy. That is a lasting one. James Ingram never tried to convince the world he was important. He trusted that if something was true, it would survive without persuasion. His songs didn't chase relevance. They waited patiently for listeners to find themselves inside them. And they still do. Long after memory faded. Long after the spotlight moved on. Long after trends changed names and faces. Some voices leave echoes. His leaves warmth. It settles into rooms quietly. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't demand. It stays. For anyone who has ever doubted their own voice, his life offers a gentle truth. You don't have to believe in yourself perfectly to matter. You don't have to be loud to be lasting. You don't have to stand at the center to hold people steady. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a voice can do is remind the world to breathe. James Ingram did that. And as long as someone presses play, as long as a song of his finds its way into a moment that needs care, his story is not over. It is simply continuing, the way it always has, softly.